Good morning, best friends. Welcome to our final class meeting. We will get started momentarily. Please do sign in if you have not already. All right, so as folks are getting signed in, I just wanted to reiterate that it has been an honor and a pleasure to be your instructor this semester. This has hands down been the craziest semester I've ever had. I've been through multiple semesters where there have been hurricanes that have caused campus to get closed down for a week or so, or even more than that. I've had to rewrite course schedules before due to weather events, but I've never, in my 10 years of teaching, ever experienced an event that has caused the level of disruption and modification to the plan that the COVID-19 pandemic has had. So you guys have been great about rolling with the punches. It's been quite a ride, and it's been an awesome journey together. Hence, I'm wearing my Journey t-shirt. Anyway, I hope that you guys have had a good time and learned a thing or two in this class despite the disruptions that we've faced. Today will be our final class meeting together. I think there are some instructors that are holding class meetings on Monday. I was told about that just a few days ago, and I don't particularly feel a need to do that, but what I will do is I'll make myself available. If anybody wants to meet with me via Zoom or have a conference during that time, I'll be here. I'm just gonna stick with the schedule that I had planned, and we're gonna finish up today and do chapter 15, which is on a very uplifting topic that I'm sure you will all enjoy discussing, the topic of death and dying. And this is a topic that we've discussed actually a little bit already in some class meetings as pertaining to the losses and experiences that some of you guys have been through. So it won't be a terribly new topic for us, but it'll be that will be the focus of the conversation today: end of life and end of life decisions. All right. So I know that you guys have some essays that I need to grade that you guys have submitted. I haven't forgotten about those, and I'll try to get to those as quickly as I can. So let's go ahead and jump into our final chapter on the final chapter of life, death and dying. Let's get those slides pulled up. So we'll start by discussing how the definition of death is not as clear-cut as it once was. The advent of modern medical science has made death a fuzzier concept. And by the way, I've decided not to do a fifth in class activity. We're just going to have the four that we've done. I had toyed with the idea of having you guys write a practice living will or doing something like that. But the problem with that is that's a lot of personal sort of information. And it's really, honestly, none of my business and none of your classmates' business, you know, what sort of end of life decisions you want to make for yourself. Although I would encourage you guys to be thinking about that and to write a living will for yourself, because you never know what might happen. We all think that we're relatively young and healthy, but you never know, you know, when some car accident might put you into a vegetative state or something like that. It's something we don't like to think about, but better to plan for that sort of thing than leave your family members not knowing what your wishes are. And that's one of the take-home messages of this chapter. So I thought about doing something with Living Will as a last in-class activity for you guys, but ultimately decided against it. So we'll just have the 4 in-class activities that we've done, and we won't have a 5th. So anyway, the definition of death is fuzzier than you might think. Traditionally, death was defined as having a person having the absence of a heartbeat and the absence of respiration. So you're not breathing, your heart's not beating, you're dead, right? And for much of human history, that was how we defined death. But now we have things like defibrillators, and we have machines that can bring people back. And there have been a number of people who have been brought back from functional death. And a number of people have come back with interesting experiences to share with regards to near-death experiences and that sort of thing. And that's an interesting literature to look at. But not breathing and not having a heart rate is not enough these days to really consider somebody dead, right? That's now what we call functional death. So what we used to call death, we now call functional death, which is the absence of breathing and a heart rate. But many people are brought back from that when they're resuscitated. Nowadays, our legal definition of death is more likely to incorporate a definition of death which includes brain death, right? And it depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on the state and the jurisdiction, and the legal definition of death varies depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at. So there's not a blanket legal definition of death, but legal definitions of death nowadays usually incorporate brain death as part of that legal definition. So when we talk about brain death, we're talking about not just the cessation of heart rate and breathing, but also there's been some sort of permanent damage to the brain so that the person can no longer function as the person that they once were. And I believe the information from the textbook indicates that it's about 5 minutes that your brain can go without oxygen, I think, if I'm remembering correctly from the textbook. I think it's somewhere around 5 minutes that your brain can go. If you stop breathing and you're brought back before 5 minutes, you can be brought back with relatively little brain damage. But after 5 minutes, people can be brought back, but the longer you go after 5 minutes, the more likely you are to see brain damage. And at a certain point, and not too long after 5 minutes, there's a much greater likelihood that the person will remain brain dead permanently, meaning that that the person will be in some form of a vegetative state where there's no consciousness, or the person just isn't there anymore. The part of the brain, like the brainstem, might still be alive, keeping the person breathing. You might get their heart rate going again. They might start breathing again. But that person, as you knew them, is no longer there because that part of the brain has died, right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about brain death. And total brain death, of course, would include the death of the brainstem as well, all parts of the brain. But there are gradations of brain death, right? So you can have the cortex, the top part of the brain, which contains all of your memories and all the things that make you, you. That part of the brain can die, but the brainstem can stay alive and keep you breathing indefinitely so that you're in what's considered a permanent vegetative state. And this is where you start to get into some real gray areas as to when to terminate care. If you have someone who's in a persistent vegetative state, at what point do you turn the machines off, right? And if the person doesn't have a living will, or the more general term for that document would be an advance directive, which indicates their wishes for how the situation is to be handled, a lot of family members have no idea what the person would actually want, right? My wife actually has a living will that she's written that's on file, and I actually need to write one of my own. As much as I lecture to my students about the importance of having one, I actually don't have my own written. So I'm a little bit of a hypocrite when it comes to this, and it's something that I need to rectify, because you never know when some sort of accident might happen or brain infection might happen that might put you into a vegetative state, and here you are being kept artificially alive on machines with your family members having no idea what your wishes were, right? And they have to guess, and it's a tough decision to have to make. So most legal definitions of death include both functional death and brain death, but because of modern technologies that we can keep people alive with, there are a lot of ethical issues surrounding death and end-of-life care that we have to grapple with these days that just weren't issues that people dealt with in times past. A comment from Sharon. Especially for organ donation. Also, pacemaker keeps heart beating after death. Yeah, so all sorts of issues that come up in this. And there's a great documentary on end-of-life decisions that I sometimes play in class, but it's an hour long. If we did have a class meeting on Monday, I would probably just play that documentary, but I don't see a particular need unless you guys are insistent that we have a class meeting on Monday. That was sort of a last minute change there, and I didn't really anticipate that, so I didn't really have anything planned for you guys on Monday. All right, so that's just a little bit on how we go about defining death. In terms of our conceptions of death, this is something that emerges kind of piecemeal during childhood. We don't really have much of a concept of death that's really concrete until late childhood. Somewhere between the age of 5 to 9, we start to form this understanding that death is final and that it's irreversible and that it's something that happens to everyone, meaning that it's universal, right? So, I remember as a kid, maybe some of you guys can relate to this. When I was a young kid, I actually had the thought cross my mind a number of times that actually, by the time I get old, they will have figured out how to allow people to live forever. And that by the time I get old, death will be something that has been figured out, and, I won't die, right? Other people die, but I won't, right? I'm not going to die ever, 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 right? And that's kind of a naive childhood belief that we all eventually get past, but maybe some of you guys can relate to during childhood having that thought or that feeling that, I'm going to be that one person that never dies, right? But by the age of 9, most of us start to have an understanding that death is something that comes to us all, and it's final, meaning that once you're really dead, that's not something, you don't come back from that. It's permanent, it's final. And that's a brutal reality to wake up to. And that is, to some degree, what is entailed in the loss of childhood innocence, right? Is the awakening to the impermanence of life. And by middle childhood, we also start to have an understanding of our cultural customs surrounding death. By the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I had already been to a couple of funerals, right? I had some aunts and uncles that had passed away, and I was starting to understand the cultural rituals surrounding death, and like wearing black and mourning and going to funerals and behaving a certain way at funerals, which is probably the reason why when my father passed away when I was 15, although I really wanted to and I thought it would have been hilarious, I decided against sticking a cigarette in my dad's mouth while he was in the coffin at his viewing. It would have been the sort of joke that he would have found absolutely hilarious, but I think I would have been the only one at the funeral or the viewing who would have found that joke funny, right? Because by that age, I had started to form an understanding that you behave a certain way at a funeral, you dress a certain way, and you're supposed to act all solemn and serious. And, personally, when I pass away, whenever that is, if folks get together to mourn my death, I would rather them have a good time, actually. I would rather it be, have fun, make fun of me, right? Give me a final roast, a send-off, right? Don't sit around all solemn and morose, and, that's not doing anybody any good. But that's probably how they'll act, because that's how we're we're culturally conditioned to behave at funerals. Kelsey says, me too. I told my husband to spend the money on tequila and celebrate my life, not flowers. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, get drunk, have fun, right? Do your thing. I don't drink, but I would absolutely want people at my funeral to have have a good time, right? And don't act all sad and morose over me, right? So by middle childhood, we start to understand these cultural customs and traditions. And adolescence is an interesting time because by the time we're teenagers, we cognitively have an understanding that we all die. It's something that we understand rationally. The brain comprehends this, but there's still this feeling of invulnerability that is part of adolescence for many of us. I should put that in my will. Order people to celebrate, maybe plan a party. Yes, I should do that, actually. That's a great idea. Maybe I will. Like one thing that gets me thinking about that is when we had my dad's funeral when I was 15. My dad was a partier. He drank, and he was a hellraiser, and he died at a young age because of that. He was 37 years old when he died, and I'll outlive him here in a couple of years because I'm about to turn 36 in June, which is kind of creeping me out a little bit. But my dad was a hellraiser. He liked to have a good time. He liked to get into fights. He liked to drink, and he was not into the solemn sort of BS that I'm talking about, right? So it kind of irritated me that at his funeral, we played a bunch of music that, this is not the sort of music my dad would have listened to, right? If my dad were here, he would have Buttermilk Biscuits by Sir Mix-a-Lot playing, right? And, would be listening to some Queen, right? And some Sir Mix-a-Lot, and would be listening to a lot of glam rock and 80s rap, right? That's the sort of stuff my dad listened to, but we're listening to these morose hymns like Amazing Grace, and it's a pretty song, I get that, but it would not have been a party that my dad would have had any fun attending, I'll tell you that, right? So but back to adolescence, there's this this sense in which as teenagers we have a cognitive understanding of death, but due, I think, largely to the hormonal changes that have emerged very recently during adolescence, there is this feeling of invincibility. And it also has to do with the lack of development of the prefrontal cortex, which we talked about before. But you hear this term personal fable talked about a lot with regards to adolescents and the way that they often behave like they're invincible. In fact, if you are unfortunate enough to die while you're a teenager, statistically, overwhelmingly, the most likely cause of death will be a car accident or you doing something really, really stupid, right? Just behaving in a high risk, dumb sort of way, like alcohol poisoning or drinking and driving, or, taking that pill that somebody gave you at the party without questioning what it was, right? Just this sense of invincibility. Strangely enough, this belief in invincibility often leads to early death, unfortunately. So overwhelmingly, a lot of teenagers have this sense of invulnerability. And I have to say that this was definitely true of me when I was a teenager, which is weird because, when I was a teenager, my dad had just died, right? I should have been hyper aware of death, given the fact that my dad died when I was 15. I should have been living with an increased awareness of mortality, you would think, right? But it was the exact opposite. I drove like a maniac. I got into multiple car accidents when I was a teenager. My car insurance ended up going through the roof. I remember by the time I was 18, I was paying $250 a month for my car insurance, and because I had just been driving like an asshole, right? And just playing acting the fool on the road all the time, and racing people, and I remember when I was a teenager, I drove a Mustang, which was, I don't know how the hell my grandmother came to that decision that it was a good idea for my first car to be a Mustang. But, I used to race my Mustang and, on the streets and, behave really irresponsibly and, trying to impress girls and other dudes, and just, acting like a moron. Right. And I'm very fortunate that, some really bad things could have happened. I kind of, I was not the most well-behaved teenager, and I'm not proud of that. I'm not promoting that. And I've often said to my grandmother who raised me, wow, looking back on that, you had the patience of a saint, right? Because I was kind of a little asshole, when I was a teenage boy, right? But this is consistent with that lack of brain development and the frontal cortex, which, gives you this sense of self-control, right? And this sense of invincibility is often par for the course for many teenagers. And I'm very fortunate that I didn't meet an early end due to some of these behaviors that I frequently engaged in as a teenage boy. And maybe some of you guys can relate to that, right? I saw Kelsey raising her hand there. Thankfully, I grew out of it, and I am actually the most boring person in the world now, believe it or not. Yeah, I think I got it all out of my system really young.
That's exactly what I did. And I had a lot of friends that didn't make it out so good, so I was pretty fortunate. And I am the most boring soccer mom, minivan driving, stay-at-home person, and I am so happy with it.
Yeah. I don't have any kids, but my life is very regimented. I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I go through the same ritual every morning. I make coffee, I feed the dogs, I clean the litter box, go for a jog, come home, take a shower, meditate, get ready for class. I don't drink anymore. It's like, and I'm very happy that way. I don't feel like anything's missing from my life whatsoever. It's just kind of, I guess I've been there.
Got it out of our system. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I did that. I did it. Did it young, got it over with.
Yeah.
I'm good now.
Sharon said, my son was in a car accident with his friends. He insisted it would not have happened if he were driving. Yeah. And there are some teenagers that are more responsible, I knew some of them growing up, and they ended up going to Ivy League schools, and, their judicious approach to life as young people paid off, and they're making a lot more money than I make now, right? So, they might not have been the most popular kids growing up, but there's something to being a straight-laced kid that I think it's underrated. I wished I had been a little more disciplined as a young person, but things seem to have been worked out for me pretty well, so I don't have too many regrets. The other thing I wanted to say about adolescence, like I said, most likely if you die as a teenager, it's going to be due to an accident, due to impulsive, irresponsible behavior. However, there are teenagers that do face terminal illness. It's not unheard of to see teenagers who have terminal cancer, leukemia. It's not unheard of, and your typical reactions to that are not positive. Teenagers who are terminally ill often develop depression, kind of similar pattern with young adults. Teenagers and young adults, when they're terminally ill, there's often a pattern of depression and anger, feeling like you were shortchanged in some fundamental way. And that's something that, unfortunately, some young folks who are terminally ill have to work through. So I'm fast forwarding a little bit here to middle adulthood. I'll just say about young adulthood that if you die during young adulthood, the statistics are kind of similar to teenagers. Young adults, meaning folks who are between the age of 20 and 40, your most likely cause of death will be due to an accident. The other two common causes of death for young adults are homicide and suicide, unfortunately. So accidents, homicide, and suicide are the most common causes of death for young people. But as you get into middle adulthood, causes of death start to shift, and chronic illness and disease starts to be the more common category of causes of death. Once you get into middle adulthood, which I'm creeping up on here, I've started getting my first gray hairs in my beard in the last couple of years, which, at first I was kind of freaking out about, but my wife says makes me look distinguished. So, okay, whatever. But, I'm creeping up on middle adulthood. I'll be 36 in June. So I've got 4 years left as a young adult. I am what they call an elder millennial, right? I'm the oldest of the millennials, as some of you are too, like Kelsey's nodding her head. Those of us who were born in the early 80s are considered elder millennials, right? So we'll be turning 40 here in the next 5 years. And so millennials are getting older, and particularly the older millennials. We're coming up on middle age. And as you approach middle age, cause of death during middle age is more and more likely to be due to health concerns. By this time, by the age of 40, the health decisions that you've made as a younger person are starting to creep up on you. Not in their full force like they will in your 50s and 60s, which I guess is still technically middle-aged. But at the beginning of middle age, they're just barely starting to creep up on you, right? So if you've made decisions like deciding to smoke as an adult and you haven't quit, or you drink a lot, or you live a really sedentary lifestyle, those sorts of health decisions are starting to affect your health by middle age. And that's the reason why you see 45-year-olds that look so different from each other, right? So the guy that owns my gym, and I may have mentioned this before, and this is the distinction between primary and secondary aging that we talked about. The guy that owns my gym, he is in his 50s, I believe, and he looks like he's 30. He looks like he's probably about 35 years old. And he's ripped. He probably works out 2 hours a day. And if I didn't know he was in his 50s, I probably would have guessed that he was in his mid 30s, right? Because he's a health nut and he's dedicated his life to fitness. Whereas you see other folks who are in their 50s who look like they're 70, right? So middle age is when these health decisions really start to accumulate and sneak up on you. Interestingly enough, middle adulthood is the time, according to psychological studies, when people's fear of death seems to be the most elevated. People don't think about death as much when they're younger. They think it's too young to happen to them. But by the time you hit 40, you have this dawning awareness that you probably have more time behind you than you do in front of you. And you start to think about your mortality a little bit more. And I think this is the root of the midlife crisis for those it happens to. But you start to think about your mortality. And the research seems to show that middle-aged adults, particularly in this culture, seem to be the folks who worry about death the most. Older folks are closer to death, but they seem to be the folks who worry about it the least, right? I guess maybe they've had more time to accept their mortality. But again, during middle adulthood, you start to see diseases like heart attacks, stroke start to happen. I know a guy who's 37 actually, and he had his first heart attack this year at the age of 37, which is kind of terrifying. Also, considering that my mother died at the age of 48 of a heart attack, that sort of stuff just scares the Jesus out of me. But, I try to eat well and exercise, and I quit smoking years ago. So hopefully some of those positive decisions will, at least I can go a few more years without kicking the bucket. Knock on wood. All right, so disease starts to pop up in middle adulthood as more common causes of death. So you're less likely to get murdered, you're less likely to commit suicide, but the bad news is you're more likely to drop dead of a stroke or heart attack. As we get into late adulthood, of course, causes of death are almost exclusively, not exclusively, I would say, but almost exclusively due to health concerns, things like cancers, strokes, heart disease. And as you approach late adulthood, which traditionally we've defined as 60 and up, although there's been some talk about about the fact that people are living longer. So some folks think that we should still consider people in their early 60s at least still middle-aged because people are living longer now. But traditionally speaking, 60 and up has been considered late adulthood. You're old enough for a senior discount at this point, right? And by this point, you're really more aware of the fact that you've lived most of your life. But interestingly enough, most older adults seem to be less anxious about death than middle-aged adults are, like I said. And maybe just because you've had more time to accept and mull things over. The term terminal decline is a term that pertains to the rapid decline in health that you often see in folks in the last year or two of their life, right? In the last couple of years of a person's life, in a lot of cases, you see this tendency for people's health to just fall off a cliff almost out of nowhere, right? So, they're 70, they're still jogging, right? They're still running 5Ks. They hit 72, 73. All of a sudden, their health goes to total crap, and within a couple of years, they're gone, right? That's terminal decline. And often along with it is a cognitive decline that goes along with that. So it's just this precipitous drop in health that seems to happen in the last year or two of a person's life. I want to talk a little bit about Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was a German psychiatrist. I believe she passed away in the early or mid 2000s. But she is known as one of the founders of the field of thanatology, which is the study of dying. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was a German psychiatrist, and she made it her mission in life to work with the dying and to help people who were dying have a more pleasant, comfortable, less scary experience with dying. So she did a lot of work with the elderly, and she spent most of her career interviewing and studying folks who were terminally ill and their family members. And she really was one of the instrumental folks who helped to give birth to the hospice movement, interestingly enough, which is very alive and well in this country. Hospice is a specialized hospital that is designed for terminally ill folks, and the focus is on palliative care, keeping them more comfortable as opposed to the focus being on trying to get them healed, right? So when someone's gone to hospice, there's the assumption that they're on their way out, but you're trying to keep them as comfortable as possible. And she was one of the leaders of the founding of that movement. And she also came up with this model of death and dying. It's a stage model. And we've talked about stage models a lot in this class and their limitations. And I think we certainly have to bear some of those limitations in mind when it comes to Kubler-Ross's model. But she developed a stage model of dying where she said that folks go through a series of stages when they find out that they're dying, where you start out by going through a state of denial, right? You get the CAT scan back and you've got a glioblastoma in the middle of your brain that's growing, that's pressing against your frontal lobes, and it's going to get bigger and bigger, and you've got maybe 6 months to live, right? Terrible way to go out, by the way. That's what killed John McCain. That's what killed Teddy Kennedy. Glioblastoma is a particularly vicious form of brain tumor. But in any case, you find out you've got a brain tumor that's growing, it's inoperable, and you're going to be gone within 6 months. Best prognosis, right? Well, what's your first reaction? You must have mixed my CT scan up with somebody else's, right? I want a second opinion. This can't be right. There's this denial that this is actually true, that this is really happening, right? So maybe you go for a second opinion. Maybe you go for a second scan. And the hope is that a mistake has been made, right? I think of the movie, I think it's called The Holiday, if I'm remembering correctly, with Queen Latifah.
Last Holiday, I think.
Last Holiday, maybe that was the name of it. Yeah. It came out several years ago. it stars Queen Latifah. And Queen Latifah plays this lady. She's a middle-aged woman who's working in this company, and she's hoping to retire in a few years. And she's got this retirement savings, and she has, these big plans for retirement with her retirement money. And she goes to the doctor one day, and the doctor pulls out some test results, and she is informed that she has cancer, and she's got maybe a year to live, right? Maybe a year. And she's like, wow, right? So she's got a year to live. So what would you do if you had all of this retirement savings saved up, massive amount of retirement savings, and you've only got a year to live? I know what I would do. I would probably quit my job and go do all my things on my bucket list, right? Not that I don't love my job. I actually love what I do. Maybe I'd keep doing it. I don't know. I love it that much. But maybe a lot of us, if we had a big giant retirement savings and we found out that we were going to be dead in a year, maybe we would quit our job and go travel the world. And as Tim McGraw says, go skydiving, go Rocky Mountain climbing, right? Isn't that a Tim McGraw song, if I'm remembering correctly, about a guy who finds out that he's dying, right? So that's what she does, right? She quits her job and she moves to Europe for the last year of her life. And she starts blowing through her retirement savings, having all these bucket list experiences that she always wanted to have. But then as she's about down to her last dollar, thinking that death is going to come any day, she gets a phone call back from the United States. It's her doctor. He's frantic, and her doctor has realized that he accidentally mixed up her test results with someone else's. She's perfectly fine. She doesn't have cancer. She's going to live to a nice old age, right? So meanwhile, she's blown through her retirement money, and she has no retirement left. But she doesn't. The moral of the story is that she doesn't feel too bad about it because she's had all of these experiences that she probably wouldn't have had, right? She probably would have stuck with that dead-end job and never would have had these amazing experiences had she not thought that she was dying, right? So I guess the moral of the story in the movie is to live like you are dying, as Tim McGraw says in his famous song about that. So I think that's the secret hope, though, right? When you get the test result that some sort of mistake has been made, that's the idea of denial. But eventually at some point you realize a mistake hasn't been made. So you go through a stage of anger where you're pissed off, maybe pissed off at God, pissed off at the world, pissed off at people who are living longer than you. And then you get through the anger stage and you go through a stage of bargaining, right? This is the stage where you say, please God, if you heal me, I'll be a better person. I'll never say another curse word again. I'll never cut anyone off in traffic ever again. I'll never cheat on a psychology exam ever again. I'm going to be the model of, I'm going to be the next Mother Teresa, right? If you can just cure me of this cancer so I don't die, please God, bargaining, right? But it doesn't work. You're still ill. The illness is still progressing. The end is still approaching. So at this point, you go through a depressed stage where, it's kind of, you just accepted your fate, not in the full acceptance like we'll see in the next stage, but you realize there's nothing that can be done about it. It's kind of a state of hopelessness, right? You enter the state of hopelessness, the state of depression, and then finally you get through that and you enter a stage of acceptance where you become more distant of other people, you kind of become more reflective, and you kind of achieve this state of peace about it all as you approach your final days, right? Those are the stages that Kubler-Ross says that people move through in their approach towards death, moving through terminal illness. Now, what we can say for Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her model on the positive end is that she was one of the very first thanatologists who really, well, I won't say she was the first thanatologist. That's actually not accurate. People have been studying death for hundreds of years, thousands of years. But she was one of the first modern thanatologists who really studied death from a psychological developmental perspective. And she should deserve some credit for putting the study of death on the map in modern psychology. And her work really led to an increased public awareness around issues of end-of-life care, and particularly to the advent of the hospice movement. Some folks have argued that the modern hospice movement wouldn't have come to be without Elisabeth Kubler-Ross having done her work. So she deserves a lot of credit. But what about this stage model itself? Well, one thing that you can say obviously right off the bat is that this model would be limited to folks who know that they're dying, right? How many folks are going to die today and don't know it, right? How many folks, like my mom, for example, who was just going on about her business at the age of 48 and dropped dead of a massive heart attack, you know, how many people are in that boat who are living their last day right now and don't know it, right? And that's something that I think of. I know it sounds a little bit morbid, but it actually makes me appreciate life more. Sometimes when I'm picking up a cup of coffee in the morning, or if I'm caressing my wife's hair when I get up out of bed because she sleeps in, and you know, I usually get up about 2 hours before she does. So I give her a little hug and a snuggle, and I caress her hair before I get out of bed in a loving way. And I try to remind myself every morning when I do that, this could be the last morning that I ever caress my wife's hair before I get out of bed, right? This could be the last morning cup of coffee that I ever have. This could be the last jog that I ever have. This could be the last time that I feed my dog. I hope it isn't, but who knows what could happen today, right? You know, life can be very short, and you don't know. A lot of folks don't know when it's going to be their last day on this earth, right? So, you know, living with that awareness of one's mortality, I think, can help make you appreciate life more. I don't do it to be depressing or morose, but to me, it just helps me have more of an appreciation for the preciousness of life. And, you know, it helps me remember not to get caught up in the day-to-day bullshit stressors. And, you know, if my wife or my grandmother or someone I care about does something to irritate me, it reminds me to not dwell on those little irritations, and to remember that we're all precious and life is short, and let things go, damn it, right? Because you never know when it might be the last time you'll talk to that person, and you don't want the last thing that you say to that person to be something that's said in irritation, right? So I try to live by that, although I'm not a saint and I don't always successfully live by that. Ask my wife, I can be an asshole. But with that said, you know, that Kubler-Ross's model only applies to people who know they're dying, right? So for those of us who don't know that we're living our last day on Earth, this model is basically completely irrelevant to us, right? What about folks who have a long, protracted fight with an illness? There are some terminal illnesses. There are some illnesses that can be terminal for some people and just be a long-term chronic illness for others, right? For example, multiple sclerosis. I have an aunt who has MS. She's lived with it for the last 20 years, and she's managed to manage it. She's relatively well off, so she can afford the best doctors and medications. So she's been battling MS for 20 years. And for a lot of people, it's a terminal illness. A lot of people die from MS, right? But it's looking like it's not going to be the thing that takes her out, right? She has other medical issues that are probably more likely to take her out, like heart trouble, and she's in her 70s. So I'm thinking that at this point, she's probably more likely to die from her heart troubles than she is from her MS. So for some people who have MS, it kills them. For other people, it just becomes a lifelong chronic illness that you fight your whole life, right? So how does that model of Kubler-Ross's apply to those sorts of folks where it's kind of ambiguous? This disease might kill me, it might not. It's kind of gotten that way with HIV now too. HIV used to be a death sentence, but now we have medications where we have folks who are living for 25, 30 years with HIV, right? And if you can afford those medications, you can live to an old age now with HIV, and something else is probably likely to take you out other than the HIV, right? So there's this ambiguity for a lot of folks as to whether or not their illness is going to take them out. So how does that model apply to those folks? Another way in which this model has been questioned is, are these stages really set in stone, right? Does everybody go through a denial stage, for example, or does everybody go through a depression stage or an anger stage? There might be some folks who never reach acceptance, right? There might be folks who go out from their last breath still shaking their fists at God, right? And never reach a stage of acceptance. So all of these stages might not apply to everyone uniformly. There might be folks who might skip some stages. There might be folks for whom some of these stages don't even apply to at all, right? So what we're getting at here in this list of cons is that the model does not apply to everyone, and it's not a model that seems to be applicable to everyone, but it does have a certain degree of usefulness. If you're someone who works with the dying, like a chaplain or a doctor or someone who works in a hospice, it's kind of a useful model for kind of getting a feel for where someone is at emotionally. But I think we should be cautious about applying this as a rigid sort of model that applies to everybody and has a limited degree of usefulness. So when it comes to end of life decisions, as I intimated early on in the lecture, we've reached a day and age where death has become a fuzzier concept, and we have ways of resuscitating people, bringing people back that never existed before, and this has led to the emergence of the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate Order. So there are some folks who are living with chronic illness, who are in a state of suffering as a result of their illness, and they have put in place a medical document called a Do Not Resuscitate Order, meaning that if they were to lose consciousness or to enter a state of functional death, as we would call it, they do not want to be brought back. We actually have a Do Not Resuscitate Order in place for my great-grandmother, who's 96 and suffering from Alzheimer's, right? She's had a long, good life. If she goes into a cardiac episode, it's time for her to go home to be with Jesus, right? There's no point in keeping a 96-year-old woman who has Alzheimer's alive on a machine forever, right? Just to keep her heart beating, right? She's 96 years old. She's had a good long life, and when her heart stops beating, as far as we're concerned, it's time for her to go home and be with the Lord, right? So she has a Do Not Resuscitate Order on file. So it's all about quality of life, right? If my great-grandmother at 96 were to have a heart attack, which would kill her without intervention, if we brought her back from that, her quality of life, it's already not great. It's probably going to be absolutely abysmal if we were to bring her back from that, right? So it just wouldn't seem like an ethical thing to do. Some people actually get a Do Not Resuscitate Order tattooed on their chest. I've heard of people doing that. I don't know if that's legally binding, though, just so you know. So if you're really passionate about the idea of not being resuscitated, for whatever reason, if you have a chronic illness or you just have a religious or philosophical reason why you don't want to be resuscitated, it's important that the doctors be fully aware of this and that you have that documentation on file legally and that your loved ones know about it so that they can tell the doctors about it. Because doctors have a natural tendency to want to try to keep people alive. Unless they're told otherwise, they're going to try to keep people alive. And unless they're told otherwise, they're going to put you on a machine. And even if you're in a vegetative state, you're going to be kept alive on that, as a vegetable in perpetuity, and unless they have some legal directive directing them to do otherwise. Doctors don't want to get sued for letting someone die. And also they just have this bias where they seem to be inclined towards wanting to keep people alive. So if you have wishes about this, it's important that you have legal documentation in place. So a Do Not Resuscitate Order is one such legal document that you can put in place. Another one is a document called an advance directive, which is also known as a living will. So a living will is a legal document that you fill out to indicate what your wishes are if you were to enter into a state where you are no longer capable of caring for yourself and making your own decisions, what your wishes would be, right? So say, for example, let's say you get into a car accident and you have severe brain damage and you're in a vegetative state. Do you want to be kept alive on machines for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years? It happens. There was a case here in Florida, actually, several years ago that made national news, the Terry Schiavo case. I don't know if you guys remember that case. This was a woman who had had a brain aneurysm, and she was basically, for all intents and purposes, brain dead, except for her brainstem, which was keeping her heart beating, and it was keeping her breathing. But this poor woman was kept alive on machines for years, literally years, until her husband finally stepped in and got a court order for her to be taken off the machines and let her go. But her parents didn't want to take her off the machines, but the husband did. So there was a court battle between the husband and the woman's parents, and the husband ended up winning, and she was taken off the machines, and she died, I think, a day or two after she was taken off the machines. But if you don't want to be kept alive forever like that on a machine, if you're in a vegetative state, you'd be best served to have a legal document in place indicating what your wishes are specifically, so that your family members don't have to guess. And don't just automatically assume that your family members know what you would want, because these are conversations that people don't have very often. So oftentimes, even spouses don't even know what their own spouse's wishes are. Thankfully, my wife does have a living will in place, and I know what her wishes are. She's been very clear to me that she doesn't want to be kept alive on a machine longer than 3 months, right? And after 3 months, she says, let me go, right? Give it your best shot for 3 months, but if I don't come back after 3 months, it's time to let me go home. And that's what she wants. And I know that. She's been very clear about that. And I need to get my act together and get my own living will in place. So I'm preaching at you guys about this, and I haven't even done it myself. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy going on here. I understand that. So a living will is one way that you can do that. Another way that you can do that is to designate a healthcare proxy, a person who is familiar with your wishes, who can make those decisions for you if you're incapacitated. And the way that you would designate a healthcare proxy would be through a legal document called a durable power of attorney. So this is a legal document that you put on file that says, if I go into a coma or I become a vegetable, here's the person I want making my medical decisions for me. And it's usually a spouse or a child, a close family member. And that person would be someone who is familiar with your wishes and will implement them when you cannot speak for yourself. Here's a hot topic. And I know the topic of suicide has come up on a number of occasions previously, and I hate that this is a topic that some of you guys have had to personally deal with. It's heartbreaking. But the question of euthanasia and assisted suicide is increasingly becoming a hot topic in our medical ethics today. My wife just got picked up by her best friend to go to her afternoon job, and my dog is upset that my wife just went out the front door. So I apologize for the barking if it becomes an issue. We're almost done anyway. But the issue of euthanasia involves facilitating the death of someone who is terminally ill and suffering. And there are two forms of euthanasia. One of them is legal and the other isn't. So passive euthanasia is basically what was done with Terry Schiavo. They took her off the machines and they quit feeding her, and they just let her go, right? So it's just basically letting nature take its course without intervening. There she goes. I knew my dog was about to go nuts. She wants in here. But I know better. She's just going to jump up on my desk and knock my computer over, and it's bad idea. Bad idea. So passive euthanasia is just letting the person go. Voluntary active euthanasia is is what's still illegal in most states. And that's when the doctor actively takes measures to end the person's life. Like Dr. Kevorkian, for example, who was a doctor who was involved in this, and he went to prison for doing this. But he would actually inject terminally ill patients with lethal cocktails of medications that would kill them to end their suffering. So that it's mercy killing, basically, is what we're talking about here. That's still illegal in most states. Now, what has become legal, please, oh my God. She's gonna drive me crazy. So what has become legal in a lot of states is what's known as assisted suicide, which isn't the same thing as active euthanasia. Active euthanasia is actually killing the person, like Dr. Kevorkian did. He actually killed several patients of his that were terminally ill that didn't want to suffer anymore.
Did he do that like with their consent, or like because he took it upon himself to do it? Like, did they ask him to do it?
It depends on who you ask. He claims that all of the people that he killed asked for it. Although the prosecutors who put him in prison claim that that there were folks whose lives he ended who were not competent to make that decision because of dementia or some other form of diminished capacity. These were folks who could not have made that decision for themselves, right? So he claims that these were all people who wanted to die. But the prosecutors who put him away claimed that that he killed some people who were not competent to make that decision, right? So assisted suicide is a little different. Assisted suicide has been legalized in 7 or 8 states, I think, at this point. And this involves getting a doctor's prescription to get a medication from the pharmacy, which you take yourself to end your own life. And Oregon was the first state to do it. I think California and New Hampshire and a few other states, maybe Maine as well. I think 7 or 8 states have legalized this. But if you're terminally ill now and you're really suffering, in these states where it has been made legal, you can get a prescription from your doctor for a medication that you go and pick up from the pharmacy. And when you take it, you go to sleep and you never wake up. So you are committing suicide, but with a prescription that's given to you by your doctor, right? It's not your doctor who's actually killing you. You're doing it yourself, but with the assistance of your physician. And like I said, this has been legalized in 7 or 8 states for terminally ill individuals who are going through extreme suffering and want to end their suffering. And this is controversial.
It's up to 9 states, including the District of Columbia.
9 states now. Yeah, so that's been expanding. I know it was like only 7 or 8 a couple of years ago. So that's been a movement that has expanded rapidly. And I'm pretty sure Florida is not one of them. But people have a lot of passionate opinions about this. You know, more religious folks, you know, often believe that suicide is a sin, and, you know, no matter what, no matter the reason. So, you know, there's a lot of religious opposition to assisted suicide, but you have other folks who believe that if you're dying and you're in immense suffering, that people should have the right to end their suffering voluntarily. There's no reason to keep someone alive when you know they're dying, and it's just going to be nothing but suffering until they go, right? So, you know, there are 2 sides to this argument. I think we're going to see more and more states legalize it. I think the southern states and the Bible Belt, which would probably include us, are probably going to be some of the last states to legalize it. It's going to be slower going. I think your blue states, your more liberal states, are going to be continuing to go this direction in the future. I think we're going to see more and more states go in that direction. Okay, so the last slide that I have for you guys is on you know, choosing a location for death if you're terminally ill. There are basically 3 approaches to this. You know, there's home care, home hospice, as it's called. This is actually what my great-grandmother is on right now. I mentioned I've mentioned a number of times my great-grandmother to you guys, who's 96 and suffering from Alzheimer's. I think I've brought her up in several lectures. She is on home hospice right now. So that means that she's under the care of a doctor, and she gets visited by a nurse several times a week, and she has a do not resuscitate order. She has a hospital bed in her home, and she's being given certain pain medications. She's got horrible hip issues and mobility problems, so she's being given pain medication to keep her comfortable. And we don't expect her to be around much longer. They put her on home hospice a year ago, and they said that she would be gone within 6 months, and that was a year ago. So she keeps outliving our expectations. It's not like we want her to die or anything. I love her. She's one of the people that raised me. But her Alzheimer's to the point now is where she doesn't even know who anybody is anymore. When she sees me, she doesn't know. She doesn't know my name. Sometimes she'll think that I'm my dad. She's my great grandmother, so she was my dad's grandma, and she was one of the people that raised my dad. So when she sees me, she'll often call me by my dad's name. My dad's name was Doug. And she'll say, "Oh, hey, Doug," and I probably look a lot like him. But she'll usually mistake me for him. She talks to people who aren't there, like dead relatives and her sisters and her brother who have passed on before her. She talks to them in her sleep. And sometimes in broad daylight, she'll hold conversations with dead people. That's how far gone she is, right? And I don't know, maybe she's actually really speaking to them. Maybe their spirits are visiting her. What the hell do I know, right? But she's definitely living in another world now, and she can barely put a coherent sentence together. And we always knew growing up, she said repeatedly her worst fear was that she would end up in a home. We always knew that about her. She was always terrified of ending up in a home. And we've honored her wishes, and we've managed to never put her in a home. We're very proud of that. Now, for people in this class who have elderly grandparents who are in homes, I understand that for a lot of families, it's unavoidable, right? It's not an option for everyone to be able to care for that person at home. Thankfully for us, it was something we were able to do. And given the coronavirus outbreak and how many elderly folks who have died in nursing homes recently due to COVID-19, we're very thankful that she's not in a home, actually. It's kind of terrifying. I think, what was it, up in Boston, there was a nursing home where like 50 people died in a week due to coronavirus, COVID-19. So I'm very thankful that we've been able to avoid that for her. And I feel terrible for my friends and students who are having to deal with that anxiety right now of having an elderly family member in a care facility and having to live with that worry that there's going to be a COVID-19 outbreak. It's been terrible for the elderly. So we've been fortunate in that regard. But she's on home hospice care. So that would be home care, the hospice at home. Now, hospice care, like I said already, is a palliative form of care. Palliative care is geared towards keeping people comfortable. So you can do hospice care in a hospice facility, or you can do it at home. Now, typically, if you do it in a hospice facility, oftentimes they will allow you to bring in that person's furniture and pictures on the wall and make it like home, right? So it feels like they're dying at home because all of their things are there. So it's less like a hospital room and more like home. And there are still a lot of folks who die in traditional hospital room settings. So that hasn't been completely done away with, but there has been a definite increase in people going towards hospice and home care in recent years because hospital rooms are kind of sterile, kind of cold places to die, right? I wouldn't want to die in a hospital room if I could help it, right? But unfortunately, a lot of people do. Okay, so that is it. I just want to reiterate that it has been an honor to be your instructor this semester, and it's been a crazy semester. I hope that going to Zoom hasn't been too much of a problem for you guys. I know a few of you guys have had me before. So this, I have students in this class. This is your second and third time having me, and it's always an honor to have students come back and take me again. I really do put my heart and soul into my classes, and I care about my students, and I hope that shows. But I hope it's been a pleasant experience despite all the upheaval. And unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, the course evaluations that we would normally do are not being done this semester. And I usually like to see the course evals because I like to get the feedback from students, but we're not doing it this semester. If you want to evaluate me, the one way that you could do that is you could go to ratemyprofessor.com. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you to do that. And if you have feelings about the way I teach, positive or negative, it is your right to express those on ratemyprofessor.com. Since we didn't get the chance to do the course evals this semester, I do value feedback from students. So I would love to see you guys again. If you haven't had general psychology or human growth, this is human growth. If you haven't had general psychology or intro sociology, I'm teaching general psychology and intro sociology this summer. And I would love to have you again if you like the way I do things. I do have some summer sections of those courses. And it is my understanding that we're going to continue to do our live classes on Zoom this summer. So instead of doing face-to-face classes this summer, we're going to be doing them on Zoom through the summer. And hopefully we can get back in the classroom for the fall. But I'd love to see you again if you want to come join me this summer from one of those classes, psychology or sociology. I hope you've had a positive experience. Keep an eye out for an email about the final exam. I'm working on writing that, and I will have more information about the final. When I have the final ready for you guys, I will send you guys out an email saying that it's ready. I'll have a study guide as well, and it will probably open up on Friday and be open through, I want to say Wednesday of next week, but I'll let you know for sure here soon. So keep an eye out for that email. And like I said, I know there are some instructors who are having class meetings on Monday. And if any of you guys do want to really have a class meeting, I can do that. I've got a documentary that I can play on end-of-life decisions that would go along really nicely with chapter 15. So, if that's something that anybody wants to do, you're welcome to, shoot me an email and we can do that, or I can just do office hours and we can have a Zoom conference if anybody just needs to talk. I am available to you guys on Monday is what I'm saying, but I don't feel like there's anything left that I really haven't covered adequately. But if you feel differently, please let me know, and we can do something on Monday if you want. But I will have that final ready for you guys, and I'll be grading those papers. So that's it. Please sign in if you haven't, and maybe I'll see some of you guys again for psychology or for intro sociology. And have a nice summer. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Maybe I'll see some of you guys around. That's it. Farewell. Later.
Mr. Carr,
Yes, ma'am.
are you going to have like a study guide for the final or something like that?
Yes, ma'am. I'll have a study guide posted here within the next day or two.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And that exam is due tonight for the quiz?
Let's see here. I think I might have
I think it's due at 11:59, I think.
Let's see here. The last quiz, I think it is due tonight. I forgot to mention that.
Yes. So I'll be working on that.
Yeah. So that's due tonight, and pay attention to those quiz items because some of those will probably show up on the exam again.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Take care.
Take care. You too. Thanks.